They didn't imagine that the president would become as powerful as he has. They had been fighting against the British monarchy as well as against the British Parliament, and they're trying to design a system where power would be divided, power would be separated. So there's executive power, and I think they recognize that in any system, the executive is going to become more powerful. So they wanted to have checks on the executive. So they also create a legislative system and also a judiciary. And these powers are meant to check each other. John Adams said that the executive and the legislative powers are natural rivals. And if one doesn't have control over the other, the weaker will ever be the lamb in the paws of the wolf. I mean, they understood power, and they understood what power can do, that for some reasons power is essential, but it can also be very dangerous. So they are trying to create a system where power will be divided. The legislature will watch the executive will watch the legislature. And also we had a system where there were states that were very important, and the states didn't want to give up any of their power. So the states maintain great control. So in the Senate, each state has 2 senators. And the electoral system was designed, the electoral college was designed so that the states really are important in choosing the president. They didn't want there to be a national system, a national election, because they knew if all power was centralized, it then would dominate everything. And they were really afraid of this because they understood history, they understood what happened, and they understood human nature. That this isn't a theoretical thing, but it is that power is something that each of us would want. And so they say ambition has to check ambition. And the system is designed not because they thought people were going to be good, but because they understood that some people are going to be bad. And you can't have a system just for good people. James Madison said, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. But he also said, if every Athenian were a Socrates, the Athenian assembly still would have been a mob. As they understood human nature, they understood people, and they weren't entirely happy with people, but then how do you create a system in which people can govern themselves, knowing all of the imperfections of human nature? I wouldn't say the presidential system was seen as perfect, but they understood there had to be executive power somewhere. And some of the states after the revolution were creating a system in which the legislature chose the executive. And often they wouldn't call the executive the governor. They would call him the administrator, or actually they would call him the president. But then think the word president had a different meaning then. The president is someone who presides. So Pennsylvania had a president, and you think, boy, a president, that sounds like a really powerful office. No, he presided over the executive council. The legislature chose an executive council to do things when the legislature wasn't in session, and then there's someone who presides over this. A governor is someone who governs. So Massachusetts had a governor who had an absolute veto over what the legislature did. Pennsylvania, no, the legislature chooses this council. And in Virginia, the legislature chose the governor or administrator. In New York had a crazy system we'll talk about later, but the states were experimenting with different systems of government, not really imagining that they're going to create this system we know today. And of course, in the 20th century, the president has become much more important. You know, you can study American history for the 19th century, and there are long periods, say, between the Civil War and 1901, it doesn't really matter who the president is, because real power is in the legislative branch, in Congress. In fact, in the early 1880s, if the Secretary of State needed an appropriation, say, to get stationery for the office, he had to go to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, who then would appropriate the money. Congress appropriates money. That's their job. Congress controls the revenue. And if you look at the United States Constitution, Article 1, so this is the first article, sets up the Congress, the legislative branch. That's really where power comes from. And then there is the executive branch, but it wasn't clear exactly what role the president would play. But as I said, in any system, power is going to centralize, and they understood this. So there's a real fear that the president would exert too much power, which is why there are checks. Yeah. So they create this electoral college. They really weren't sure how to choose a president. At the time, the country was quite big. It's a lot bigger now, and there are very different interests in these different states. And having the legislature choose the president would make the president the tool of the legislature. They wanted the executive to be somewhat independent. So how do you choose? And the system they created, that they thought they were creating, worked much differently, would have worked much differently than the system as it's evolved. They thought that what would happen is these electors would gather in each state, and the Constitution says they have to meet in each state capital on the same day. And that was to prevent Britain or France from coming over and bribing whoever this council is. You know, we can think about the Roman Catholic Church. The cardinals choose the Pope. And in Poland, there was a similar kind of election. The Diet would choose the king. And in Russia and Germany, and the German states were very much interested in who would become king of Poland. So they wanted to avoid that kind of foreign interference. So the electors meet on the same day in each state, and each elector has to vote for two people. By the way, the electors also can't hold any office under the United States. So these are supposed to be disinterested people. And they have to vote for two people. One has to be from a state other than their own. They thought that everyone in Massachusetts will vote for their favorite Massachusetts people. Everyone in Georgia will vote for their favorite Georgia people. So they have to vote for someone who is not from their state. And what they thought would happen is all of these votes would be cast, and from this you may get a lot of people who just have votes in Delaware or in Georgia or in Massachusetts, but then there would be others who would get support from other places. You know, everyone knew George Washington, for example, or John Hancock. So they will get some support. And then from these people, the Congress would choose from among the top two or three. So they thought this would be a system where the electors actually are nominating the candidates, then Congress is making the election. And when Congress voted, each state would have one vote. Another big, important disagreement they were having is Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, the big states thought population should govern everything, so we should have more votes in the legislature. Smaller states like Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut said, no, we'll be absorbed by the others unless we have some power of our own. So the Congress sets up this difference between big states, the big state, small state disagreement, and in the electoral system, each state is equal. And then when Congress, or I should say when Congress votes, each state has an equal vote. And so this is what they imagined, they imagined the system would work. And it really only worked like this 2 or 3 times. And it was for reasons they couldn't have imagined. That is, the Congress made the choice among the top two vote getters in the Electoral College. Other than that, what happened was political parties emerged, and the political party leaders like James Madison on the Republican side or Alexander Hamilton on the Federalist side figured out how you could get the electors all to support the same people. So very early on this happens. In the 1790s, George Washington was elected unanimously. Every elector voted for George Washington, and then they voted for someone else. 34 of them voted for John Adams, so he got the second most number of votes, so he became vice president. There were 69 electors, so 69 electors voted for Washington. 34 of them also voted for Adams. 35 of them voted for lots of different people. George Clinton, the governor of New York, John Jay from New York, others who get support from the electors, but then Washington and Adams become president and vice president, and then in 1792, again, elected Washington again unanimously. 1796, first election in which Washington is not a candidate. And then Adams gets the most votes. Thomas Jefferson came in second. By this time, Jefferson is the candidate of the opposition. So he does, though, get the second highest number of votes, because a lot of the electors who voted for Adams then voted for someone else, other than, I think Charles Pinckney was their candidate for vice president. So Jefferson gets 68 votes, Adams gets 71. So Adams, the leader of the Federalists, becomes president. Jefferson, the leader of the Republicans, becomes vice president. And then in 1800, the Republicans really are able to mobilize, and Jefferson beats Adams, and however, all of the Republican electors voted for Thomas Jefferson and for Aaron Burr, who was the vice presidential candidate. So now under the Constitution, things are tied. So the Federalists say, wait a minute, there's a tie. Congress will have to choose between Jefferson and Burr. And the Federalists in Congress said, we're going to vote for Aaron Burr because he's a politician. He's someone we can deal with. Jefferson, they thought, was this ideologue. And they really didn't like Jefferson. Burr is someone they didn't trust, but they thought they could deal with him. And so Congress had 37 ballots. That is, they voted 37 times. The Federalists all voting for Aaron Burr. And so he and Jefferson only needed, I think, 9 states to be elected president. However, for 36 ballots, he gets the votes of 8 states. And then finally, on the 37th ballot, couple of the Federalists electors decide that they will not vote, and then their state goes for Jefferson. So you have this system where the president and vice president, you're voting for 2 people you think are going to be president, and the person who comes in second will be vice president. The only reason we have the office of vice president really is to make the electoral college work, because you're voting for 2 people. What happens if someone gets a big number of votes? Well, make him vice president. He presides over the Senate. And the vice president, through most of American history, really hasn't had much to do. And immediately after this election, the Republicans say, we've got to change this. So they make the system where the electors vote for 2 people. One is going to be for president, the other is going to be for vice president. Federalists didn't like this idea because they thought they're going to carry the office into the market to try to get the support of some state, which is what they were doing already. I mean, Jefferson was from Virginia, Burr was from New York, and they're trying to get New York to vote for the Republicans. So it's a system, they weren't creating the system as we know it today. They were creating a system to grapple with the problems they had. The system has emerged today, and the other big problem, or big change in the system has been the way the candidates are chosen. And we have a system, a really smart candidate like Barack Obama can figure out how the system works and thus can get the nomination. You know, you have some states which have a primary, and then some states which have caucuses. And what Obama did was go to the caucus states where Democrats very rarely competed. So places like Montana, South Dakota, very strong Republican states. However, there are Democrats there, and much to Hillary Clinton's surprise, Barack Obama is winning the caucuses in Idaho and in South Dakota. And the way the press operates, too, and nothing against the press, they do want to know who's ahead. So the 2 states that vote first are Iowa and New Hampshire. And Iowa has a caucus system where you as a candidate know in each town there are going to be these caucuses. So you get your supporters there. So then all of the supporters of this candidate stand over there, this candidate stand over there, other candidates. So around the room there are these groups. But if a candidate only has 2 votes, those people have to go somewhere else. So the real goal is to get more people on your side. And it's a very complicated, cumbersome system. By law, in Iowa and New Hampshire, they have to vote first. You know, the primaries really started in the early 20th century as a way of breaking the power of the political bosses, the party bosses who could decide who the candidates would be, and let the people make these choices. So California had a primary early on to choose candidates. Other states did this. And then the presidential primaries really started around 1908, 1912. And not every state had them. And New Hampshire's primary really became important in the 1950s as it was the first. And so, of course, we want to know, gee, well, what are voters thinking? And so New Hampshire had a primary. I think initially it was in March. Now it's in January because other states said, boy, by the time the election gets to our state, it's already been decided. So we want to have our vote earlier. And so about in the 1980s, a group of southern states and states in the Midwest created what they called Super Tuesday. We'll all have a primary on the same day. I think the benefit of the older system was you would have these campaigns going on around the country where candidates really have to talk to ordinary voters. They all go to the same diners. They all go to the same factory gates to meet with voters. And people who are in these places have a great deal of proprietary interest in this. They want to know who the candidates are, and they make a judgment. I think what's happened is the judgment of handfuls of people in Iowa and New Hampshire is the choice the rest of the country is left with. And so there's really been no effective way of countering this or of coming up with a different system. But we can see every 4 years there are changes in the system, often to address a problem that happened the previous election cycle. So for example, were you going to ask a question?
Go ahead.
So in 1968, there was a split in the Democrats, pro-Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War. You know, the Johnson administration supported, they were held responsible for the Vietnam War, which hadn't been going that well, and there were a number of anti-war candidates, Eugene McCarthy first, then Bobby Kennedy entered after McCarthy. Doesn't win the New Hampshire primary, but he does get enough votes that people say, wait a minute, Johnson seems weak. And so Johnson announced he wasn't going to run again, and also that because he wanted to make sure that peace in Vietnam happened, okay? Then Bobby Kennedy entered the race. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, also gets into the race too. And the party bosses, leaders really liked Hubert Humphrey. Eugene McCarthy was a poet and anti-war guy and kind of a flake. And the whole thing, there was violence at on the streets at the convention, the Democratic convention. For some reason, Johnson became the focus of anti-war activists as opposed to the Republicans who weren't clear where they stood. And after this, the Democrats say, well, we really need a better way of choosing candidates. So they said, we'll have more primaries. Instead of the party bosses having this power, have more primaries so the people can choose. And the person who wrote the rules for the Democrats in choosing the candidates for the night before 1972 was George McGovern. And he becomes the Democratic nominee. Of course, no one knows the system better. And he carried one state. Okay. So the Democrats say, well, that really didn't work. We needed a way to change the system. And so they have another commission to change the rules so that it won't just be, someone can't come out of nowhere and do this. And the person who wrote the rules this time was Jimmy Carter. And he becomes the nominee, and he wins. And then the Republicans in 1976 also had a split. Ronald Reagan ran against Gerald Ford, did very well, but Ford wins. Reagan supports Ford, gives a wonderful speech at the convention, an extemporaneous speech about what the Republicans need to do. And Carter, as you know, was elected president, but then in 1980, Reagan is elected. And the Democrats don't really recover until the early 1990s. The rules pretty much remain the same. There are some additions to it. I think the big change is in how the candidates are chosen. I mean, we still have the system where the electors gather every 4 years on the same day. It's early in December, and vote. So here in Boston, they meet at the Massachusetts State House, and it isn't the wisest men in the state. It's when you go and vote. In some states, it actually says on the ballot, you're voting for the electors who are going then to vote for these candidates. In some states, if you are supporting a candidate whose name isn't on the ballot, there are a lot of minor parties in the United States, and some don't get on the ballot in every state. But if you want to vote for that candidate, what you have to do is write in the names of the electors who are going to vote for that. The parties choose these electors. So if you're a Democrat and you've been nice to the party, they'll say you can be a presidential elector. If you're a Republican, they'll say you can be a Republican elector. And then those are the 8 or 14 people from the state who then go and meet the Republican or the Democratic electors. You already know who they're going to vote for. It's very rare that they vote for someone else. So that hasn't changed, but we do see in the 19th century the states choosing the electors through a popular vote. And in some cases, the electors were chosen by congressional district. In other cases, there's a statewide thing. I mean, the states can allot the electors however they want, but it is these individuals, and this is their only job, being a presidential. I mean, they do have another job. This is something they do one day, maybe the only time in their life they are these electors. So one change you see in the 19th century is having the electors determined by popular vote. The first election for president in which we have actual vote tallies was 1824. Because it didn't really matter how many votes someone got. The really important thing is, did you get more votes in Massachusetts? And in some states, until the Civil War, the state legislature chose the electors. So in New York, for example, in April of 1800, there's an election for the legislature, and the Republicans win. So the Federalists say, okay, they're going to choose electors. It means New York's going to go Republican. Alexander Hamilton wrote to the governor, John Jay, saying what you should do now to prevent New York from going Republican is to call back into session the legislature that was elected 2 years ago, that the Federalists controlled. Have them change the rules so they choose the electors rather than the new legislature. And this is one of those really pivotal moments. And I think probably in any political society, if you are the governor and you're a Federalist and the other side just won, it means your state's going to go the other way. You're going to say, yeah, I'd better do something to prevent that from happening. But this is one of those moments. John Jay never even answers the letter. He knew New York was going to go Republican, but that was the way the rules were written. And he knew that if we start changing the rules because we want a different outcome, we really don't have a system of laws. We're going to have that happening every 4 years. We're going to have the kind of political infighting and partisanship. So Jay acted as a great statesman then, just ignoring Hamilton, who wanted, let's change the rules so our side can win. No, we know what the rules are, and we'll play by the rules. Otherwise, we really don't have a system of laws and not of men. The thinking was, you cannot have a Republican system, that is a system where essentially they believed that there are 3 different kinds of political systems. There are empires, China, the Ottoman Empire, and there you have centralized power. And that works over a large area because everyone is afraid of whoever is in power. Okay, so there's certain benefits to that and certain detriments. That's the kind of system that works over a large area. Then there are aristocracies, places like Germany, or if they knew more about Japan, they might have said Japan operates like this, where they're the daimyo who gather every year, but then they're kind of semi-independent in their provinces. And what keeps one of the daimyo or one of the German princes from deciding I'd rather be emperor is their sense of honor. And then there are the republics, and these they thought had to be relatively small, where people have a common interest, or people will know their neighbors and know who is in charge. If you have a bigger system, for example, in Massachusetts, the population then was about 300,000 or 400,000 people, and there are about 300 people in the Massachusetts legislature. So if you're going to use that same kind of ratio for representatives in a national system, you would probably have about 1,000 or more representatives, and that simply wouldn't work. So their thinking was, the people in the states know better who is their legislator, who is their governor. The states have very different systems. If you tried to create that kind of system over a country that then had 3 million people, you would have this very unwieldy Congress, and there wouldn't be any clear sense of someone in Massachusetts knowing what was of interest to people in Georgia, or people in Virginia knowing about what was happening in other parts of the country. So you need a lot of things to be happening on the state level. Real power on the state level, and the things that the federal government would be doing would be foreign affairs, for example, trade agreements with other countries, relations with the Indians. Those are all things we understand that the federal government should do because another country doesn't want to have to make a deal with every one of the 13 states and so on. But then for a lot of other things, what kind of school system they should have, what kind of taxes they should have, and most taxes are going to be at the local level, would be happening at the state level as opposed to at the national level. I mean, there's a fear that power was going to become centralized in this. If you create a system where by the way, if they had come out of the Constitutional Convention saying we're creating a national government, it would have been absolutely defeated. I used to say it would be the same as if we said we're going to create a socialist system. I mean, the idea of socialism has become more popular among certain people in the country of late, but the idea of nationalism would be anathema to most Americans because they understood a national government was going to subsume everything into it, and they would think their real attachment was to their state. And states had bills of rights, states had protections of citizens, and if your state legislator is doing something you don't like, you vote him out. If you're going to have a relatively small Congress, the Congress as they created only had 100 people initially, because that's one for every 30,000 people. So if you're going to have, are you really going to know who your congressman is? Will they be responsive to you? In fact, a word that enters the English language vocabulary in this period is responsibility. And it's not the way we think of responsibility, that is, it's your job or your duty. It's the responsiveness of your representative to you. I mean, who is responsible? Patrick Henry asked. Patrick Henry thought the Constitution was a bad idea because he said there is no responsibility, because these people in the federal city will be so far away from you as ordinary citizens, you'll have no control over them. Or accountability would be a better, the word responsibility really is closer to what we think of as accountability. We know who did something. Well, the presidency has, ebbed and flowed, usually during wartime. James Madison is really the only president who serves during wartime in which the executive power does not expand. And he's not a very effective president during wartime, but I give him credit for not expanding either the power of the president or the executive branch or the federal government. Jackson, who becomes president in 1829, does really expand the power of the president because he sees the president as a check on Congress. And remember, in 1824, Congress had prevented Jackson from becoming president, so he has a grievance about Congress, and he saw himself as the tribune of the people. That is, he is elected by all of the people, whereas members of Congress are elected by people in all of these different districts, so he speaks for everyone. Now, there are people in Massachusetts didn't much want Jackson speaking for them, but however, Jackson also believed that the states should have more power than the federal government. So it's a curious thing where the executive is taking more power, but also sees that the states are more important here. But the Civil War is really the time when the executive branch does get more power, and it's also a war fought over state versus national government, and the national government wins quite overwhelmingly. And Lincoln, very effective wartime president, and understands the nature of the war as well as the aftermath of it is going to lead to the strengthening of the federal government. However, it takes a long time before the country catches up with this idea. That is, after the Civil War, Congress impeached President Johnson, and then Congress puts checks on whom the president can appoint, and so on. In fact, in the early 1880s, the president wanted to appoint someone to be the customs collector in New York. The senators from New York said, we decide who gets to be the customs collector in New York. And the president said, no, I get to decide this. Both of the senators from New York resigned from the Senate. And then, because they knew what would happen is the New York legislature would elect them again. And then the president would see, New York really likes them more than they like me, which is what happened. The president said, I'm not going to be the registering clerk of the Senate. And the Senate essentially said, well, yes, you are. And the real change in the 20th century is with the elevation of Theodore Roosevelt to become president, and then Woodrow Wilson becomes president during the First World War. And Wilson was really a believer in a parliamentary system. He saw that the president should be more like a prime minister and really control Congress in a way that the prime minister does. And as, of course, during the First World War, when the United States enters the First World War, Wilson takes more power than any other president had ever imagined taking, basically running the entire economy as a wartime necessity and doing other things to make the United States win the war. You remember in 1916, Wilson had been reelected as president, and his slogan was, he kept us out of war. He said there's such a thing as being too proud to fight. He didn't think the United States should get into this war. He said it's between the British Empire, the German Empire, and we really don't have a stake in this. After he's reelected, he realizes we do have a stake in this, so has to change immediately and get the country to accept that we're going to war and mobilize for the war, take over the economy as a way of running the war. So the entire food supply is under the direction of the federal government. The railroads are run by the federal government. The press is censored by the federal government. So you have all of these new things introduced, and at the same time as the war happens, there is prohibition imposed on the manufacture and sale of alcohol. And that requires the federal government to develop a police force for the first time. All police powers had been in the states. That is, if you kill someone in Massachusetts, it's Massachusetts that's responsible, and you're not going to appeal your case to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court's not going to look into murder convictions in state courts. That's up to the states. So Wilson, though, takes this power into the executive branch And then in 1920, the Republicans are elected, and to a large degree, they scale back on what the federal government had done. Warren Harding pledges a return to normalcy. However, there are some things that some of these Republicans think, boy, it really is good if the federal government can do this. And probably the most creative of them was Herbert Hoover, who becomes president in 1929. And Hoover convenes a national conference on unemployment and a national conference on the problems with the agricultural sector. And problems with the agricultural sector, it's something other countries are experiencing because farmers can produce more, which means they get a lower price for their goods, so there are too many farmers. So what do? Of course, Stalin in the Soviet Union shoots the excess farmers. We're not going to do that here. Have to figure out a way to try to get the farmers maybe to move to the cities and take manufacturing jobs. But then when the world manufacturing economy collapses, Hoover is kind of stuck. And Hoover is defeated by Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been Undersecretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration, and he says that the president should have as much power to combat this domestic emergency, that is the Depression, as he would if the nation were at war. So it's really during the New Deal that the president, the executive branch, begins getting more power, and Congress, controlled by the Democrats, says this is great. Even, the Democrats had taken control of Congress in 1930 when Hoover was president, and they pushed for things like regulating banks and mortgages and other things as a way out of this emergency. And then once the federal government has these powers, they're not going to give them up. But then the real boost in executive power and power of the federal government, you can kind of see, World War I, it happened, but then things go back. New Deal, you see a centralization, and then when the economy recovered, things will go back. But what really changes, of course, is the Second World War, and then following that, the Cold War, in which, for the purposes of national security, you do need to have a president, and the Republicans in the 1940s under the Truman administration said that politics stops at the water's edge. The Republicans aren't going to argue with the president over the conduct of foreign policy. And then when Eisenhower becomes president, the Democrats agree, we're not going to argue because we're in this really tense world, so we need to speak with one voice. And that's something you do see changing during the Vietnam War, and even more recently, as people from both parties feel, they'll go to another country and criticize whatever the president is doing if they don't like him. It's something you wouldn't have seen earlier in the century. So we have a two-party system that emerged. It's not something the Constitution recognized or thought would happen, but it is something that happened, and in many ways, the system makes it possible. And we've seen it used by each side as a way to get political advantage, but also some of the underlying currents here, underlying principles are still there. That is, the states maintain a great deal of power in this system, and we don't have a national system, as Hillary Clinton discovered in 2016. It doesn't matter how many votes you get. You need to carry the states that have these votes because it's 270 is the magic number, not 39 million or 80 million or however many votes she got, 270.